There is a moment that does not announce itself. No sound, no visible marker, no date to remember, but it arrives anyway, quietly, almost politely. And at first it feels like nothing at all, just a faint sense that the air has changed inside your own life, that something once assumed is now slightly out of reach, not removed, not denied, just no longer handed to you without question. And the strange part is how easy it is to miss, because everything still looks the same from the outside. The days still pass, the routines still run, people still smile and ask how you are doing, and yet beneath that surface a subtle shift has occurred where decisions that once belonged to you begin to arrive already shaped, already framed, already leaning toward an outcome someone else finds more convenient or safer or easier to explain. And you notice it first in the smallest places, the kinds of choices that never felt like choices before because they never required permission or discussion, the kind you made without thinking because they were simply yours, like when to leave the house, what time to eat, how late to stay up, whether to rest or push forward, whether to answer a call now or later. And none of these moments feel dramatic enough to resist, so they slip by without resistance. Accepted in the same way one accepts a minor inconvenience, something not worth addressing, something easier to accommodate than to name. And it is precisely this ease that allows the change to deepen, because nothing forces you to stop and say something is being taken. Instead, it feels like something is being offered, a suggestion, a convenience, a gesture of care. And care is hard to argue against, especially when you have lived long enough to understand how fragile bodies can become, how unpredictable health can be, how quickly energy can drain. So you nod, you agree. You allow the adjustment, and in doing so you participate in a quiet exchange where autonomy is traded not for control but for relief, not for obedience but for peace, and the cost does not appear immediately. It hides behind good intentions and practical reasoning, and because you have been responsible your entire life, because you have learned to adapt, to compromise, to choose battles carefully, you adapt again, believing this is just another season, another phase, nothing worth dwelling on. Yet something inside you notices the difference, a faint tightening, a mild sense of displacement, like standing in a familiar room where the furniture has been moved just enough to make you hesitate before walking through it. And you tell yourself it is nothing, that this is what happens with time, that this is natural, that everyone goes through it. And the danger of that thought is how reasonable it sounds, how mature, how accepting, because it allows you to dismiss your own discomfort as unnecessary, even selfish. And slowly you begin to question not the change itself but your reaction to it, wondering if you are being difficult, if you are resisting what is simply practical, if pride is clouding judgment, and this self-doubt becomes another layer of silence where nothing is said because nothing feels wrong enough to name, and yet the feeling persists that something once unquestioned is now conditional, that your authority over your own life is no longer assumed but evaluated, measured against safety, against efficiency, against what others believe is best. And it happens without confrontation, without anyone raising their voice or making demands. It happens through tone, through phrasing, through gentle redirection, through the slow replacement of asking with informing. And at first you barely notice the language shift, how questions soften into statements, how options narrow into recommendations, how your preferences are acknowledged but no longer decisive. And because you are polite, because you have lived long enough to understand social harmony, you do not interrupt the process to correct it. You let it pass, telling yourself there will be time later to reassert yourself if needed, and that later keeps moving forward, staying just out of reach, while the present continues to fill with small accommodations, small agreements, small silences. And one day you realize that the sense of being a burden did not arrive from weakness or dependence, but from displacement, from the gradual experience of being managed rather than trusted. And the irony is how this feeling grows even when you are still capable, still thinking clearly, still able to decide, because the issue is not ability, it is assumption. The assumption that you require oversight, that your choices need review, that your judgment benefits from guidance, and these assumptions are rarely spoken aloud. They live in pauses, in glances exchanged over your shoulder, in plans made without your input and presented as settled. And you feel them not as insult, but as erosion, a slow wearing away of something essential, and because it happens gradually, you adjust your posture without realizing it. You speak a little less, you explain yourself a little more, you justify decisions that once needed no explanation, and this justification plants a subtle seed where you begin to see yourself through the lens of others' concern, measuring your actions against how they will be received rather than whether they are right for you. And that is where the burden feeling truly begins, not in needing help, but in feeling observed, evaluated, managed, and the mind responds by shrinking its demands, lowering expectations, choosing the path of least friction, and over time this becomes a habit, an internal negotiation where you preemptively remove yourself from decisions to avoid discomfort. And this feels like cooperation, like maturity, like wisdom, but underneath it is something else, a quiet retreat from authorship. And the tragedy is not that others step in, but that you begin to step back, relinquishing the subtle authority that once guided your life without effort. And you remember how once you made choices simply because they felt right, without needing consensus, without needing validation. And now, even when no one explicitly objects, you feel the invisible weight of expectation pressing against your decisions, shaping them before they are fully formed. And this weight makes ordinary choices feel heavier than they should, turning daily life into a series of small calculations about impact and inconvenience. And this is when the word burden starts to whisper in your mind, not spoken by others, but inferred, imagined, constructed from patterns you sense but cannot fully articulate. And because you are thoughtful, because you care about those around you, this imagined burden carries real emotional weight, making you hesitant to assert needs or preferences, making you grateful for what is offered rather than confident in what is yours. And none of this requires anyone to intend harm. It thrives on kindness, on concern, on the belief that efficiency is care and that safety justifies oversight. And because these values are socially praised, resisting them feels inappropriate, even ungrateful. So you remain silent, telling yourself you are overthinking, that this is simply the natural progression of age. And yet the internal discomfort remains, because something fundamental has shifted, not in your body, but in your position, not in your capability, but in your perceived authority. And you feel it most clearly in moments of pause, when you catch yourself waiting for approval you never needed before, when you hesitate before acting even though no one has told you to stop. And that hesitation reveals the quiet loss that has been unfolding, the loss of unquestioned self-trust. And it is here in this subtle awareness that the truth begins to surface, that autonomy does not disappear in a single event, but fades through 1,000 small concessions, each reasonable on its own, each easy to justify, and together forming a pattern that slowly shifts the center of decision-making away from you. And recognizing this does not come with anger or rebellion. It arrives as a sober understanding, a calm but unsettling clarity that something essential is being diluted, and that the feeling of being a burden is not a reflection of your worth, but a response to this quiet repositioning. And once this realization begins, it cannot be unseen, because you start to notice how often your own instincts are softened before being expressed, how often you defer without being asked, how often you choose harmony over authorship. And this awareness is not dramatic. It does not demand immediate action. It simply sits with you, asking to be acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement, the story truly begins, not with resistance but with seeing, not with change but with honesty. And this is where awareness lives, not as a solution but as a turning point. The moment you understand that nothing has been taken forcefully, but something has been quietly set aside. And the question is no longer who is doing this, but how much of it you have learned to accept without noticing. At some point, awareness sharpens into recognition, not as a sudden revelation but as a pattern coming into focus, like a familiar shape emerging from fog once you stop walking and stand still long enough to see it. And what you recognize first is not malice but structure, not cruelty but process. The way certain interactions repeat with slight variations until repetition itself becomes evidence, and you begin to notice how help arrives already carrying direction, how concern arrives already carrying conclusions, how questions are framed so narrowly that the answer is predetermined. And this recognition does not come with outrage, because outrage would imply surprise, and there is very little surprise left, only a slow assembling of moments that once felt isolated, but now line up too neatly to ignore. And you start to see how often decisions are introduced as settled facts rather than open discussions, how plans are shared rather than formed together, how your role shifts from participant to recipient. And none of this is declared openly. It lives in phrasing like "this makes more sense," or "this will be easier for everyone," or "we already talked about it and thought this would be best." And the striking part is how often these statements are delivered with warmth, with reassurance, with an assumption of agreement, leaving no obvious opening to object without appearing difficult. And because you have spent decades navigating social dynamics, because you understand the cost of friction, you recognize the subtle pressure embedded in this kindness, the way it invites compliance rather than conversation. And at first you tell yourself this is simply efficiency, that people are busy, that coordination requires decisions, but then you notice how rarely the efficiency works in your favor, how often it seems designed to minimize uncertainty for others rather than preserve agency for you. And this is when recognition deepens, because you begin to see that help is not neutral. It carries values, assumptions, priorities. And when it replaces consent, when it arrives without invitation, it quietly shifts the balance of power. And this shift does not require force. It relies on your willingness to accept assistance as inherently positive. And that willingness is something you cultivated yourself over a lifetime of cooperation and responsibility. And now it is being used as leverage, not intentionally perhaps, but effectively. And the pattern becomes clearer when you look at how your preferences are acknowledged verbally, but overridden practically. How someone will say, "Of course it is your choice," while simultaneously arranging everything in a way that makes any other choice inconvenient, impractical, or socially awkward. And this creates a strange internal conflict, where you are told you are free while being guided firmly toward a specific outcome. And because the language affirms autonomy, it becomes harder to challenge the reality of its absence, and you begin to understand that control does not always look like restriction. Sometimes it looks like facilitation, like smoothing the path in only one direction. And the more you recognize this, the more you see how often safety is used as a justification. How frequently the word safe appears when explaining why something has been decided for you. And safety is powerful because it positions dissent as irresponsibility. Because who would argue against safety? Who would insist on choice when risk is mentioned? And yet risk has always been part of living. It was part of your life long before anyone began managing it on your behalf. And you recognize the imbalance in how risk is framed now, how your tolerance for it is questioned, how your capacity to weigh it is quietly doubted. And this doubt does not need to be spoken aloud. It lives in actions taken without consulting you, in decisions made in advance to prevent hypothetical problems. And over time you realize that the real issue is not help itself, but the erosion of permission. The way help moves from something you request to something you receive automatically, and this automatic nature strips it of respect, turning it into management. And management has goals, metrics, outcomes, and rarely includes the person being managed as an equal authority. And you feel this shift most acutely in conversations where you are informed rather than asked, where explanations replace questions, and you recognize how easily this dynamic establishes itself because it appeals to everyone involved. It simplifies coordination for others. It reduces anxiety. It creates a sense of control over uncertainty. And the cost of this simplicity is borne quietly by you, in the form of reduced authorship. And because you do not want to be seen as ungrateful, because you understand that intentions are good, you swallow the discomfort and tell yourself it is not worth addressing. And this is exactly how the pattern sustains itself, through silence framed as maturity, through acceptance framed as wisdom, and recognition brings with it a heavier understanding. That once this dynamic is established, it rarely reverses on its own because others come to rely on it. They become accustomed to deciding, to arranging, to managing, and any attempt to reclaim agency later is met with confusion, sometimes even concern, because you are stepping out of the role that has been quietly assigned to you, and roles are powerful because they shape expectations, and expectations shape behavior. And you begin to see how your own behavior has adjusted to fit this role, how you ask fewer questions, how you volunteer fewer preferences, how you accept outcomes you might once have challenged, and this self-adjustment reinforces the pattern. confirming to others that their approach is working, that you are comfortable, that everything is fine. And recognition brings with it a kind of grief, not dramatic but steady, because you see how easily this could have been different, how a few simple questions, a few genuine pauses could preserve dignity. And yet the system moves toward efficiency rather than presence, and you recognize that society at large encourages this movement, valuing speed, safety, and predictability over individual rhythm and choice, especially when age enters the equation, and age becomes shorthand for fragility, for decline, for diminished capacity, regardless of your actual condition. And you see how language reflects this, how phrases like "at your age" or "given your situation" appear, how they frame you as a category rather than a person. And this categorization makes it easier to justify decisions made on your behalf because categories are managed, individuals are consulted, and recognition deepens. When you see that this process is not limited to family or close relationships, it appears in institutions, in systems, in interactions with professionals who speak to you with a mixture of politeness and assumption. And you recognize the tone, the way explanations are simplified, the way options are limited, the way your input is acknowledged but rarely shapes the outcome. And because you have lived long enough to recognize patterns, you cannot unsee this once it becomes clear. And the feeling of being a burden begins to make sense not as a personal failing, but as a structural consequence. Because when decisions are made for you, your presence becomes a variable to manage rather than a voice to include. And variables are burdens by definition. They complicate plans, they require adjustment, and this recognition is sobering because it reveals that the burden feeling is not something you imagined. It is the emotional echo of being repositioned within a system that prioritizes smooth operation over shared authority. And recognition does not immediately change anything. It does not restore what has shifted, but it sharpens your perception. It makes you aware of each moment where help crosses into control, where concern crosses into permission, and this awareness carries weight. Because you begin to feel the tension between what is offered and what is taken, and you realize that the most dangerous aspect of this process is how normal it feels, how easily it integrates into daily life, how rarely it triggers alarm, and recognition brings with it a quiet resolve not to react impulsively, but to see clearly, to understand the mechanics at play, and to recognize your own role in sustaining them, because autonomy is not only lost through external action, but through internal accommodation, and seeing this does not yet tell you what to do. It simply removes the illusion that nothing is happening, and that removal is irreversible, because once you recognize the pattern, every interaction carries a new layer of meaning. Every suggestion, every arrangement, every decision made without you stands out, and this recognition marks the end of innocence, the end of believing that good intentions automatically preserve dignity, and it leaves you standing in a more complex reality where care and control coexist, where help can both support and diminish, and where the responsibility to protect your internal authority becomes clearer. Even if the path forward remains uncertain, and this recognition is heavy, because it asks you to hold two truths at once, that others may genuinely care, and that their care may still cost you something essential, and holding these truths without bitterness requires a steadiness that does not come easily. But recognition does not ask for action yet, it asks for honesty. And in that honesty, the next phase quietly waits. There comes a stage where recognition settles into something heavier, something that sits in the chest rather than the mind, because once patterns are seen, they begin to shape how you experience yourself in relation to others. And this is where loss makes itself felt, not as absence but as weight, the weight of being repositioned slowly, almost gently, into a role you did not choose and were never formally offered, a role defined less by what you can no longer do, and more by what others assume you should no longer decide. And the loss here is not dramatic enough to provoke confrontation. It does not arrive with a single humiliating moment or a clear line crossed. It arrives through tone, through pacing, through the way conversations subtly reorganize themselves around you. And you feel it when people begin to explain things you already understand, not because you asked, but because they assume clarity is needed. And you notice how their voices soften, how sentences become shorter, how complexity is filtered out, and none of this is meant to insult. Yet the cumulative effect is unmistakable. because you are being addressed not as a peer but as someone to be guided, and this guidance changes how you are seen and how you are expected to behave, and you begin to sense that your presence now carries a different kind of gravity, not authority, but obligation, not leadership, but responsibility for others to manage you correctly. And this is where the burden feeling deepens, because being managed means you are no longer simply included, you are accounted for, and there is a subtle but profound difference between those two states. Inclusion assumes agency, accounting assumes oversight, and oversight implies risk, and risk implies liability. And liability is never neutral. It shapes behavior around prevention rather than trust. And you feel this shift most strongly in how people talk about you when you are present, using language that frames you as someone to be handled carefully, someone whose comfort and safety must be prioritized above your preferences. And this framing slowly strips away the expectation that you might accept discomfort, inconvenience, or challenge as part of a chosen life, because choice itself is no longer assumed. And when you notice this, something inside you tightens because you remember how often you accepted difficulty willingly in the past, how often you chose the harder path because it aligned with who you were. And now that history feels invisible, irrelevant to the current narrative that defines you primarily through vulnerability, and this erasure of your past strength contributes to the loss because you are no longer seen as the sum of your lived experience, but as a present condition to be managed. And the tragedy of this is how quietly it unfolds, how rarely anyone says you cannot decide, and yet how often decisions proceed without your meaningful input. And this is where loss becomes emotional rather than intellectual, because you begin to feel yourself receding within interactions, speaking less, not because you have nothing to say, but because you sense that your words will not alter the outcome. And this anticipation of irrelevance becomes self-fulfilling, as silence confirms others' assumptions that you are content to be led. And each time this happens, a small piece of your internal posture shifts. You sit back rather than forward. You observe rather than engage. And this withdrawal is not conscious, it is protective, a way to avoid the discomfort of being politely ignored. And over time, this posture becomes familiar, even comfortable. And comfort is dangerous here because it masks the cost. And the cost is the slow repositioning of your identity, from someone who decides to someone who adapts, from someone consulted to someone informed. And this loss shows itself in how people speak about plans, how they reference your needs rather than your wishes, how they emphasize convenience and safety over meaning and preference. And you realize that you are being spoken about in the third person even when you are present, not literally but structurally, as if your role is to be considered rather than to consider. And this shift changes the emotional texture of daily life because you begin to feel like an object of concern rather than a subject of intention. And this is profoundly destabilizing because a life lived as a subject has a different weight, a different coherence than one lived as an object. And when subjectivity erodes, dignity follows, not because anyone disrespects you overtly, but because respect without agency is incomplete. And you feel this incompleteness in moments where your opinion is acknowledged politely but does not influence decisions, where your objections are met with reassurance rather than revision. And this creates a strange loneliness, because you are surrounded by people who care, yet feel fundamentally unseen. And being unseen while being cared for creates a specific kind of isolation, one that is difficult to articulate because complaining feels ungrateful, and gratitude becomes another layer of silence. Another reason to swallow discomfort, and this swallowing accumulates, turning into a dull ache that colors interactions. And you begin to anticipate being a burden before anyone suggests it, adjusting your behavior to minimize inconvenience, declining invitations, limiting requests, downplaying needs. And this preemptive self-limitation feels like courtesy, like maturity. But it is also surrender, and the surrender is subtle because it is framed as consideration for others. And who would argue against consideration, especially after a lifetime of being responsible? And yet this responsibility becomes asymmetrical because you are expected to consider others' comfort more than they consider your autonomy. And this imbalance deepens the sense of loss because fairness is disrupted quietly, without anyone acknowledging it, and you begin to feel managed not only externally but internally, policing your own impulses, censoring your desires, And this internal management is perhaps the most significant loss of all, because it means the system no longer needs to impose control. You have learned to impose it on yourself, and this internalization is efficient, invisible, and deeply effective, and it manifests in the way you hesitate before expressing preferences, the way you soften statements into suggestions, the way you accept outcomes that leave you slightly diminished, and over time these small diminishments accumulate into a broader emotional state where you feel less solid, less grounded in your own authority. And this is where the burden feeling becomes personal, because you begin to see yourself through the lens of others' management, perceiving yourself as a problem to be solved, a responsibility to be shared, a factor to be optimized. And this perception erodes self-respect, not through insult, but through implication. And the loss here is not only of autonomy, but of narrative, because the story of who you are is being rewritten subtly, from protagonist to dependent, from decision-maker to consideration. And this rewriting happens without your consent, and yet your silence allows it to proceed, and recognizing this creates a quiet grief, because you see how easily this could have been different, how a culture that valued consultation over efficiency could preserve dignity. And yet the culture you live in rewards smoothness, speed, and risk avoidance, and older individuals become sites of risk in this framework, to be minimized rather than engaged. And you feel the emotional weight of this every time your independence is praised abstractly while being limited practically. Every time someone says you are doing great while arranging your life in ways that reduce your influence over it. And this contradiction is exhausting, because it requires you to hold two opposing messages simultaneously, that you are respected and that your authority is constrained. And holding this tension drains energy, leading to further withdrawal, further accommodation. And this cycle deepens the loss, because energy that once fueled engagement is now spent managing internal conflict. And you may notice how you feel tired after interactions that used to energize you, how social situations now require more effort because you are navigating not only conversation, but positioning, assessing when to speak, when to yield, when to assert. And this constant assessment is itself a form of labor, one that goes unrecognized. And unrecognized labor contributes to the feeling of being a burden, because you are expending effort to make things easier for others while feeling increasingly invisible. And this invisibility is not absolute. People still see you, still care, but they see a version of you shaped by assumptions, and the gap between who you are and how you are treated becomes another source of quiet pain. And this pain does not explode. It settles. It becomes background noise, a hum beneath daily life. And you may find yourself longing not for independence in a dramatic sense, but for something simpler. To be asked sincerely, to be trusted fully, to be treated as someone whose choices matter even when they involve risk, inconvenience, or disagreement. And the absence of this trust is what defines the loss, because trust is the foundation of dignity, and without it, even well-intentioned care feels hollow. And this is the stage where the realization deepens that autonomy is not only about action, but about recognition. Being recognized as a thinking, choosing individual whose life still belongs to them. And when this recognition fades, the loss is profound, because it affects not only what you do, but how you feel about who you are. And this feeling lingers, shaping mood, shaping posture, shaping the way you occupy space. And the most painful aspect is how normalized it becomes, how easily you begin to accept this diminished positioning as inevitable, telling yourself this is just how things are now. And this acceptance feels like resignation, not dramatic but steady. And resignation is heavy because it closes off possibility quietly, and this is where loss settles fully, not as an event, but as a condition, a background state where autonomy feels distant, dignity feels conditional, and the sense of being a burden becomes less a fear and more an identity. And sitting with this identity is uncomfortable, but it is also clarifying because it reveals what has been lost not in theory, but in feeling. And feeling is harder to dismiss, and this emotional weight marks the deepest point of the arc, the place where something essential has been diminished, and where the cost of quiet accommodation becomes undeniable. Even if the path forward is not yet visible, there is a point where the weight of loss no longer presses downward, but settles into stillness, where the constant low hum of resignation gives way to something quieter and more deliberate. And this is where clarity begins, not as relief but as steadiness. A calm recognition that emerges when emotional noise subsides enough for truth to surface. And this truth is not comforting, but it is stabilizing because it reframes what has been happening in a way that returns something essential to you, even if nothing outward changes yet. And the clarity arrives when you realize that while many things have been taken without asking, one thing has only ever been surrendered, never seized. And that thing lives entirely inside you, untouched by schedules, arrangements, or concerned voices. And it is the internal position from which you meet the world, the quiet authority you carry regardless of how others behave. And understanding this does not erase the losses you have felt. It does not undo the moments of being managed or spoken over, but it changes how those moments land, because you stop interpreting them solely as evidence of your diminishing value and begin to see them as reflections of systems and habits that operate independently of your worth. And this shift is subtle but profound, because it loosens the internal identification with the role you have been placed in, and you recognize that while others may treat you as a burden, that treatment does not define what you are unless you allow it to reorganize your inner stance. And clarity lives in this distinction between how you are positioned and who you are, between the roles assigned and the authority you retain internally. And this authority is not loud. It does not announce itself. It does not demand recognition. It simply exists as a steady sense of self-trust, a refusal to outsource your judgment entirely, even when cooperation is required, and you begin to see that autonomy was never only about doing things alone. It was about owning the meaning of your actions, the reasons behind them, and that meaning remains accessible as long as you do not abandon it. And this realization brings a different kind of calm, because it removes the urgency to fight every external imposition, to correct every assumption, to reclaim autonomy through confrontation, and instead it invites a quieter form of resistance, one that operates internally first by refusing to collapse inwardly, even when outward choices are limited. And you see how much power you have been giving away, not through action, but through interpretation. Interpreting others' behavior as proof of your inadequacy, interpreting accommodation as evidence of decline, and clarity reframes these interpretations, allowing you to see accommodation as strategy rather than surrender, silence as choice rather than erasure. And this does not mean passivity. It means discernment, choosing where to invest energy, choosing when to assert and when to let things pass without internalizing them. And you realize that the most corrosive aspect of the burden feeling was not how others treated you, but how their treatment altered how you saw yourself, how it tempted you to adopt a diminished self-image. And clarity interrupts this process, restoring a sense of internal authorship even within constrained circumstances. And you begin to understand that dignity is not something others grant you through respect alone. It is something you maintain by how you relate to yourself, by whether you continue to see your own preferences as legitimate, your own judgments as valid, even when they are overridden. And this understanding does not romanticize independence. It does not deny the realities of aging, of changing capacity, of needing assistance. It simply separates assistance from authority, recognizing that needing help does not negate the right to self-definition. And this separation is crucial, because when help is conflated with control, dignity erodes. But when help is seen as a tool rather than a verdict, autonomy can persist internally, even when externally constrained, and clarity brings with it an awareness of how easily you had begun to equate compliance with goodness, how you had measured your value by how little trouble you caused. And this metric is exposed now as flawed, because a life reduced to minimal inconvenience is not a life fully owned. And owning your life does not require making it difficult for others. It requires maintaining an internal alignment where your actions, even when cooperative, are chosen consciously rather than reflexively. And this alignment restores a sense of coherence that had been fractured, because you stop reacting to every instance of being managed as a personal diminishment and start responding from a place of internal steadiness. And this steadiness is not visible to others. It does not change how they speak or what they assume, but it changes how deeply their assumptions penetrate. And this is where clarity resides, in the realization that while you cannot control how others perceive you, You can control whether their perceptions redefine you, and this control is subtle. It shows up in how you listen, how you answer, how you agree or disagree internally, even when outward agreement is necessary. And you may notice that when this internal clarity is present, the burden feeling loosens its grip, because you no longer see yourself as a problem to be managed, but as a person navigating a system with awareness. And awareness restores agency in unexpected ways, because it allows you to choose your responses rather than default to self-erasure, and you begin to feel a quiet separation between your inner life and the external choreography around you. A separation that protects your sense of self without isolating you from others. And this balance is delicate, but it is sustainable because it does not rely on changing others' behavior, which is often beyond reach. It relies on maintaining your internal position, which remains accessible as long as you attend to it. And clarity also brings an understanding that autonomy does not require constant assertion. It requires consistency, a steady refusal to relinquish self-respect even when circumstances limit expression. And this refusal is not confrontational. It is private, lived internally, and because it is private, it cannot be taken away. And this realization is grounding, because it shifts the focus from what has been lost to what remains, not as consolation, but as fact. And the fact is that while routines, decisions, and roles may shift, the capacity to think, to choose internally, to hold meaning, remains intact unless you surrender it. And clarity rests here in this unassailable space, and occupying this space changes how you move through the world. Not dramatically, not visibly, but perceptibly to yourself, because you feel less reactive, less diminished, more rooted, and this rootedness does not erase the challenges of aging or the frustrations of being managed, but it provides a stable center from which to engage them. And this center is where autonomy truly lives, not in the absence of help, but in the presence of self-recognition. And recognizing this does not end the story, but it prepares you for what comes next, because once clarity is established, the question is no longer how to stop others from deciding for you, but how to inhabit your life in a way that preserves internal authority regardless of external arrangements. And this question does not demand an answer immediately. It simply opens a space, a quiet readiness for a different posture, one that does not seek permission to exist fully. And this readiness signals the transition into something new, not loud, not defiant, but quietly owned. There is no moment where this final shift announces itself, no internal speech declaring a new phase, no visible change that others can point to and name, and that is precisely why it lasts. Because quiet autonomy does not depend on recognition, it does not ask to be seen. It settles in as a posture, a way of standing inside your own life that no longer waits for permission, no longer seeks confirmation, and no longer measures itself against how convenient or acceptable it appears to others. And this posture is not rigid, it is not defensive, it is calm, almost understated. But it carries weight, because it is rooted in a decision that has already been made internally, even if it is never spoken aloud, the decision that you will not abandon yourself in order to make things easier for others. And this decision does not turn you against anyone. It simply realigns your loyalty back to where it belongs, and from this place, your interactions begin to feel different, not because people behave differently, but because you are no longer negotiating your worth within each exchange. You are no longer silently asking whether your presence is justified, and this absence of internal negotiation frees energy, the kind of energy that was previously spent anticipating inconvenience, smoothing edges, and minimizing yourself. And with that energy returned, something steadier takes its place, a sense of ownership that does not need to manifest as control over circumstances, because it exists as control over interpretation, and interpretation shapes experience more than outcome ever could. And you begin to notice how much lighter things feel when you stop translating every decision made for you as evidence of your decline, and instead see it as information about the system you are moving through. And this perspective creates distance, not emotional withdrawal, but clarity, the kind that allows you to cooperate without dissolving, to accept help without absorbing the message that you are lesser for needing it. And this distinction is subtle, but it transforms how you experience daily life. Because you no longer internalize the role others project onto you, You wear it lightly when required and set it down when it no longer serves. And this ability to set it down is autonomy in its quietest form, and it shows itself in moments where you choose not to explain yourself, not to justify preferences, not to apologize for existing with needs and desires. And these moments are small, almost invisible, but they accumulate, and over time they re-establish a sense of internal continuity, the feeling that you are still the same person making choices, even when those choices adapt to reality, and adaptation no longer feels like surrender. It feels like strategy, and strategy restores dignity because it implies agency. And agency is what was missing. Not independence in the practical sense, but authorship in the internal one. And from this posture you begin to relate differently to the idea of being a burden, because the word loses its power when it no longer defines you, and you see that burden is a label applied from the outside, often unconsciously, often structurally, and labels only penetrate when they are accepted internally. And once you stop accepting it, it becomes background noise, something you hear without absorbing. And this does not make life frictionless. It does not stop people from assuming, from deciding, from managing, but it prevents those actions from rearranging your sense of self, and this prevention is everything. Because self-respect does not require control over others' behavior. It requires control over your internal alignment. And alignment is what returns here quietly, steadily, without ceremony. And you may notice that with this alignment, your presence changes in subtle ways, not louder, not more forceful, but more grounded. And groundedness alters dynamics without confrontation, because people respond differently to someone who is not seeking validation, even if they do not consciously recognize it. And you may find that you speak when it matters and remain silent when it does not out of resignation, but discernment. And discernment is a form of autonomy that often goes unrecognized because it does not announce itself. And this selective engagement preserves energy, preserves dignity, and preserves choice. Because you are no longer reacting to every encroachment as a threat, you are choosing where to invest yourself. And this choice restores a sense of control that had been eroded by constant accommodation, and you begin to feel less managed internally, even if external management continues, because the internal compliance has ended, and ending it does not require confrontation. It requires awareness sustained over time, and sustaining awareness is work. But it is quieter work than resistance and more effective because it does not exhaust you, and you realize that autonomy was never about doing everything yourself. It was about remaining intact within yourself, and intactness is what returns here piece by piece through consistent self-recognition. And you no longer measure your value by usefulness, by convenience, by how little space you take up. And this shift is liberating, not because it changes your circumstances, but because it changes your criteria. And criteria shape self-evaluation, and self-evaluation shapes emotional life. And with this new criteria, being helpful is a choice rather than an obligation. Being accommodating is an option rather than a requirement. And when these actions are chosen rather than imposed internally, they no longer diminish you, and you can offer cooperation without feeling erased. And this balance is the essence of quiet autonomy, because it allows you to remain connected without being consumed, present without being managed internally. And this autonomy expresses itself in small rituals, small decisions reclaimed privately, like how you spend your attention, how you interpret tone, how you allow or refuse internal diminishment. And these rituals rebuild trust with yourself, the trust that was undermined when you began deferring reflexively. And rebuilding this trust is slow, but it is steady, because each time you honor your own judgment internally, you reinforce the message that you still belong to yourself. And belonging to yourself is the deepest form of independence, one that cannot be legislated, scheduled, or supervised away. And this belonging does not isolate you from others. It actually improves connection because you no longer relate from a place of self-doubt. And relationships feel cleaner, less charged, less exhausting, because you are not constantly translating yourself into something acceptable, and you may notice that the urge to disappear recedes, replaced by a quieter confidence that does not seek attention. And this confidence is not optimism. It does not deny loss, it simply refuses to let loss define everything. And this refusal is gentle but firm, lived daily rather than declared. And in this way autonomy returns not as a reclaimed territory, but as a lived state, one that coexists with limitation, with age, with assistance, without being negated by them. And this coexistence is the maturity of autonomy, the understanding that dignity does not require isolation or defiance. It requires self-possession. And self-possession is an internal act, repeated quietly until it becomes natural again. And you may find that when you inhabit this posture consistently, the fear of being a burden loses its urgency, because even if others perceive you through that lens, you do not see yourself that way. And self-perception carries more weight than external judgment ever could, and this is the final realization. Not dramatic, not comforting, but stabilizing. That autonomy does not need to be granted back to you. It was never fully removed. It was only obscured by habit, by silence, by accommodation mistaken for virtue. And once you stop mistaking the two, the path forward becomes clear in a quiet way. Not as a plan, but as a stance, a way of moving through the world without shrinking, without announcing resistance, without waiting to be invited into your own life. And from this stance, every choice you make, even small ones, carries a different weight, because it is made from ownership rather than permission, and this ownership is invisible to most, but deeply felt by you. And that feeling is enough because it restores coherence, dignity, and a sense of authorship that no amount of external management can fully erase. And living from this place does not make you immune to loss, but it makes loss survivable without internal collapse. And that is what quiet autonomy ultimately offers. Not control over outcomes, but control over alignment. And alignment is where dignity lives, steady, unspoken, and intact.